So this video, we're going to review some of the basic information about trophic levels and add in a few details. You probably want to take a few notes as we go through them. So this first slide is really showing a basic trophic level diagram. So we have producers at the bottom. So these are your photosynthesizers in most systems. This could be phytoplankton in the ocean or grass or trees, plants, in terrestrial ecosystems. So those producers are then eaten by your primary consumers. Again, in aquatic systems, this could be the zooplankton or any kind of herbivores in terrestrial systems, things like grasshoppers up to cows that eat grass. All right, the primary consumers are then eaten by secondary consumers, and secondary consumers are eaten by tertiary consumers. And occasionally, especially in aquatic systems, this may actually continue on and you might have a quaternary consumer, for example. Notice off to the side here what's happening. You see these detritivores and decomposers. Their job is to break down matter and recycle it, right? Think about what would happen if there were no decomposers. Right? Quickly, there would just be a lot of dead stuff. So they have this vital role of recycling matter so that the producers can then take it up again and it can cycle its way through the various trophic levels. All right, so when we look at trophic levels, we often draw these pyramids, okay? And this pyramid is always trophic level on the y-axis. The x-axis can be a couple of different things. It could be energy content, or sometimes they graph the amount of biomass or number of organisms. And usually, no matter which of those you graph, you see this. You see a lot of producers, and then a smaller amount of your primary consumers, smaller amount secondary, and smaller amount tertiary. And if you think about this, think about top-level predators, things like, the big cats, tigers, hawks. You don't see very many of these because each level you go up, you have less organisms. And remember to relate this to the energy that each level has available to it, okay? So remember when we did our little activity, how much energy is being lost, so therefore each one can support less of the level above it. Okay, you do see instances, however, where you might see an inverted pyramid. And this can happen in a couple different circumstances. So note this first one, it's an inverted pyramid of numbers. So remember when I said on the previous slide, it could be amount of energy, it could be biomass, or it could be numbers. And usually it still works out. But what if your producer is a huge oak tree, right? Obviously that oak tree can probably host lots of herbivores, and those herbivores may have lots of, for instance, in this case, parasites that prey on them. All right, and so this gives you this weird sort of inverted pyramid. Let's look at the second version over here. Now look at what we're looking at. 4 grams per square meter, 8 grams per square meter, 12 grams per square meter. So this is looking at the biomass. And again, it's inverted. So instead of having more producers, you have less. So this one is really kind of, how do we think about this, right? Because there is the law of conservation of matter. We can't create new matter. So how is it going from 4 to 8? You might want to pause the video and think about this for a second. Notice that your producers here are your phytoplankton. This is an aquatic system. Okay, pause and think about it. Okay, did you come up with an answer? So think about the lifespan of these producers. There's lots of them, but they don't take up a huge biomass per square meter, but they're reproducing very quickly, much more quickly than the herbivores are. So even though at any given time you'll have less biomass, overall you're still going to have more. So does that kind of make sense? So these are some exceptions to the rules. Notice this can only occur when you're graphing numbers or biomass. The amount of energy is always going to observe that first regular style pyramid. Okay, and that was just what we just went over. Okay, so here are some definitions. Food chain, this is when you just have that linear, this is eaten by this, which is eaten by that. And the rule here is only about 10% of the energy is transferred from one level to the next. In real life, this might vary depending on the food chain, but 10% is a good back of the envelope calculation, and it's the number you'll need to do any sort of problems like this, where they're asking you to figure out how much energy is available to the next trophic level. So 10% is transferred. The other 90% is lost as heat, basically due to respiration. Food webs are looking at this relationship sort of more realistically in an ecosystem where you have lots of food chains all kind of going on at the same time. So it's used to represent feeding relationships in ecosystems more realistically. So here is a food web that's showing all the various things. So this could be in a temperate forest like you might see in Maryland, for instance. You have deer that are eating the grasses. So you have grass, deer, you might have some parasites on the deer. All right. At the same time, you may have things like rabbits or deer mouse that are also eating the grass, and then things that eat them. So snakes, you may have some birds in here. So this is a food web. One thing to note on both food chains and food webs is the direction of the arrows. Okay, this is important whenever you're asked to draw either a food chain or a food web, is to make sure you get the arrows going in the correct direction. The arrows follow the energy. So here you have the grass, the energy from the grass is going into the deer, right? The energy of the deer is going into the parasite. Think of it that way. At least that's what I do so I don't get confused. Okay, so one thing that ecologists started to think about was basically, are all of those different organisms in that food web sort of equal members? So what happens when we start to remove different parts of that food web? And as scientists did these experiments, they realized that some organisms exert a greater influence on the community than others. And they call these keystone species. So here's an arch. For those of you that maybe are in engineering, you've done this. There's an arch. This keystone is holding this whole arch together. So if you remove the keystone, the arch falls apart. That's the same idea as a keystone species. It exerts great influence on a community's composition and structure relative to its population size. So often, these are members of the ecosystem that might not be there in large numbers, but they have an overall greater effect. So the classic example of this is this ecosystem in the Pacific coast where you have kelp forests. So kelp is a type of seaweed, and sea urchins are the herbivores that are eating the kelp. So the kelp are the primary producers. The sea urchins are your primary consumer, and then you have sea otters that eat the sea urchins, okay? And what happened here is the sea otter population crashed. And when this happened, the whole ecosystem fell apart. So the sea urchins now exploded in numbers because there was nothing to hold their numbers down. And when they exploded in numbers, they basically ate all the kelp. And the kelp is this really sort of lush forest of seaweed that lots of other organisms live and hide and hunt in. And when you destroyed that, the whole ecosystem lost a lot of its biodiversity. Okay, so here are some graphs kind of showing this. So when you have total kelp density is high, the urchin biomass is lower, and the otter biomass is high. When the otters started to decrease, you have the kelp decreasing, which then the urchins increase, and you see that effect. it turns out when they later asked, well, what's happening to the sea otters? It turned out that the killer whales, the orcas, were starting to eat the sea otters because their primary food source was becoming more scarce, and so they turned to the sea otters. So you had this sort of cascading effect. This effect, when an ecosystem sort of falls apart like this, is referred to as a trophic cascade. All right, and so here's just kind of a real life example of how you might think about this. So notice this map here. This is pointing out the Great Lakes. So this is in Michigan, Minnesota, that area. And an invasive species was the zebra mussel. So the zebra mussels basically invaded the Great Lakes and kind of took over. And they became a pain for both the ecosystem and for sort of humans' economic loss because they clogged a lot of intake pipes, for instance, to power plants and such. But they proliferated so much, and zebra mussels, if you know, are like other bivalves. They actually filter the water, and in this case, they started filtering it so much that the water actually became like super clear. So you see the phytoplankton and the zooplankton are decreasing, which in turn caused these plankton eating fish to decrease, right? At the same time, this clear water allowed aquatic plants to grow better, all right, because the sunlight could penetrate more deeply. And then you have more bottom feeding fish, more bacteria and benthic. So benthic means bottom, invertebrates. But the native mussels and clams deteriorated. So this is the kind of thing ecologists would study, is what's happening to these food webs when you either remove, or in this case, when you add a species in that wasn't there in the first place. And this map is just showing the spread of the zebra mussels. And you can see most of the spread has been down through the rivers. But notice there's a few dots out here. And you might ask, well, what happened here? So it turns out that zebra mussels are very hardy, and they actually could hitch rides on boat hulls. All right, and so after this happened, people sort of started to realize, and so now in a lot of different lakes and reservoirs and streams, you're not allowed to bring boats in from other areas. So if you've ever canoed in Loch Raven, you know that that's a rule in that reservoir. And it turns out that zebra mussels are not the last invader. There's a new invader called the quagga mussel. And they're basically literally really trying now to stop the spread of these so that it doesn't turn into that map of zebra mussels. We will see how successful that winds up being. We'll talk more about invasive species in the next unit. Okay, so I hope you learned a little bit about food webs, maybe filled in a few gaps in your notes. And I'll see you in class.